What if the person you threw away, the one you called dull and worthless, turned out to be a diamond? This is the shocking story of Richard Rees, a millionaire who publicly humiliated his boring wife, Clara, casting her out for a more glamorous life. He thought he had it all: the money, the power, the perfect trophy wife to replace the old one. But months later, his world shattered. Staring at his television, he saw a ghost from his past transformed. There she was, the woman he'd discarded, now the face of an international luxury brand captivating millions. This isn't just a breakup story. It's a tale of brutal betrayal, secret identities, and a spectacular revenge served on the world stage. The end wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow, creeping rot that had been festering for years in the sterile, marble-floored mansion Richard Rees called home. From the outside, the Rees residence in the most exclusive enclave of Greenwich, Connecticut, was a monument to success. A sprawling neoclassical fortress of white stone and glass. It overlooked the Long Island Sound, its manicured lawns rolling down to a private dock where a sleek yacht, the Legacy, bobbed gently on the water. Inside, however, the air was thin and cold, much like the conversations between Richard and his wife Clara. Richard Rees was a man forged in the crucible of Wall Street. At 45, he had the kind of sharp, predatory good looks that only came with immense wealth and unwavering self-assurance. His suits were Tom Ford, his watches were Patek Philippe, and his ambition was limitless. He had built his private equity firm, Rees Capital, from the ground up, turning a modest inheritance into a multi-billion-dollar empire through a series of ruthless, brilliantly executed takeovers. He saw the world as a chessboard, and he was always 10 moves ahead. Everyone and everything was a piece to be positioned for his benefit. For 20 years, Clara had been his queen, a quiet, steady presence by his side. But queens, he was beginning to feel, could be exchanged. Clara Rees née Peterson was, in a word, graceful. At 42, she still possessed the understated beauty of her youth, a canvas of soft features, kind hazel eyes, and honey-blonde hair she usually kept in a simple, elegant chignon. She was the calm in Richard's storm, the quiet hum beneath his roaring engine. She had managed their homes, the Greenwich estate, the Park Avenue penthouse, the St. Bart's villa, with quiet efficiency. She'd raised their 2 children now away at elite boarding schools with a gentle hand. She'd planned the perfect dinner parties, charmed his business partners with her poise, and stood silently by his side at countless charity galas, a serene smile fixed on her face. She was, by all accounts, the perfect corporate wife. And that was the problem. The rot began in the silences. It grew in the spaces between them on the king-sized bed, a chasm as wide as the Atlantic. It thrived on the perfunctory kisses goodnight, the conversations that skimmed the surface like stones on water, never delving deep. Richard had changed, or perhaps he had simply become more himself. The thrill of the deal, the adrenaline of the market, was the only thing that made him feel alive. Everything else had faded to grey. His world was a blur of private jets, high-stakes negotiations in Dubai, and champagne-fueled celebrations in Monaco. He was surrounded by people who glittered supermodels with razor-sharp cheekbones, tech billionaires with disruptive ideas, European aristocrats with ancient names and modern appetites. And when he came home, there was Clara. Clara, who preferred a cup of Earl Grey tea to Cristal champagne. Clara, whose idea of a thrilling evening was curling up with a history book by the fire. Clara, who would ask him about his day, and he would see her eyes glaze over as he spoke of leveraged buyouts and hostile takeovers concepts as foreign to her as ancient Sanskrit. He saw not a partner, but a relic of a past life, the woman he'd married when he was still hungry, still striving before he'd become a king. Now he needed a queen who shone as brightly as his crown. The final catalyst was a woman named Annelise Delacroix. She was the French-born creative director of a luxury fashion house his firm was considering acquiring. Annelise was everything Clara was not: fiery, ambitious, and dripping with a raw, unapologetic sensuality. She challenged him, argued with him about art and finance, and looked at him with an undisguised hunger that mirrored his own. She saw him not just as a provider, but as a predator, an equal. Her presence in his life threw Clara's quietude into stark, unflattering relief. He started to see his wife through Annelise's imagined eyes, and what he saw was boring. He became cruel in small ways. He'd mock her simple dress sense at a party. "Did you get that at a bake sale, darling?" He'd sneer, just out of earshot of their friends. He'd belittle her interests. "Ah, another book about dusty kings and queens. Fascinating," he'd say with a theatrical yawn. He stopped coming home for dinner, offering clipped, unapologetic excuses about late meetings that both of them knew were lies. Clara absorbed it all with a quiet dignity that only infuriated him more. She never rose to his bait, never screamed or threw things. She would just look at him with those calm, knowing eyes, a flicker of hurt in their depths, and it was that knowing look that he hated the most. It was as if she could see the shriveled thing his soul had become, and her silent judgment was more damning than any trade. The day he ended, it was a Tuesday in October, crisp and clear. The autumn leaves were a riot of gold and crimson, a fiery spectacle that felt like a mockery of the cold death unfolding inside the house. Clara was in the conservatory, tending to her orchids, her hands gentle as they misted the delicate petals. She was wearing a simple cashmere sweater and jeans, her face bare of makeup. She looked domestic, wholesome. In his mind, the word landed like an insult. He strode in his custom-made leather shoes, clicking ominously on the flagstone floor. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Clara, we need to talk." She turned a small, hopeful smile on her face, perhaps thinking he was home early for a reason that involved her. The smile died when she saw his expression. It was the same look he wore when he was about to gut a competitor's company, cold, decisive, and devoid of all sentiment. "I want a divorce," he said. The words hung in the humid air, thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. Clara didn't gasp or cry. She simply stood there, the silver misting bottle held loosely in her hand, her face paling slightly. "I see," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Her composure was the final straw. He wanted a reaction, a confirmation of his power over her. He needed to break her. "Let's be honest, Clara." He began, his voice taking on a tone of condescending reasonableness. "This hasn't been working for a long time. We've grown apart. We want different things." "What is it that you want, Richard?" she asked, her gaze steady. "I want a life," he shot back, gesturing around the opulent, sun-drenched room. "A real life. Not this quiet, sterile, boring existence." The word, his favorite insult for her, was finally out in the open, sharp and venomous. "You think I'm boring?" It wasn't a question. "I don't think it. I know it," he said, pacing now, energized by his own cruelty. My life is moving at 1,000 miles an hour. I'm building an empire. I need a partner, an equal, someone who understands my world, who can keep up. Annalise. He stopped, but it was too late. The name was out. Clara's eyes flickered with the first real sign of pain. Annalise Delacroix. Yes, Richard said, seizing on it. She's alive. She has fire. She's not content to just sit in the background and arrange flowers. He waved a dismissive hand at her beloved orchids, a gesture that felt like a slap. He expected tears. He expected pleading. He got none of it. Clara placed the misting bottle down with a deliberate, steady hand. She straightened her spine, and for the first time he saw something in her eyes that wasn't hurt or gentleness. It was a flicker of steel, ancient and hard. 20 years, Richard, she said, her voice low and dangerously calm. For 20 years I have been the foundation upon which you built your empire. I hosted the dinners that won you clients. I raised the children you barely saw. I created the peaceful home you retreated to when your alive world became too much. I built this quiet, boring life so that you could have your loud, exciting one. Don't try to play the martyr, he scoffed. You lived a life of unimaginable luxury. I lived in a gilded cage, she corrected him softly. And I did it willingly because I loved the man I married. But that man is gone. I'm not sure he ever really existed. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and he felt a sudden unnerving chill, as if she were seeing right through his expensive suit and his carefully constructed persona. The lawyers will be in touch, he said, turning to leave, eager to escape that piercing gaze. I'll be generous, of course. You'll be well taken care of. I don't want your money, Richard, she said, her voice stopping him at the door. He turned back, incredulous. What? The house, the cars, the accounts. You can have it all, she said. I want only one thing. And what's that? He asked, a smirk playing on his lips, assuming she'd ask for some sentimental piece of jewelry. My freedom, she answered, and my name. I will no longer be Mrs. Reese. I will be Clara Peterson again. I want you to erase me from your life as completely as you seem to want. A genuine laugh escaped him, then loud and incredulous. The fool. She was actually letting him off the hook. She was walking away from a fortune, from the very identity he had bestowed upon her. It was the ultimate proof of her simplicity, her utter lack of ambition. Fine, he said with a magnanimous shrug. Have it your way, Clara. Be whoever you want to be. Just don't come crawling back when you realize how cold the world is outside of my protection. He walked out of the conservatory without a backward glance, leaving her standing among her flowers. He felt a surge of exhilaration, of liberation. The final boring shackle had been cast off. He was free to build his new life with his new exciting queen. He was Richard Reese, and the world was his for the taking. He never imagined that the woman he left behind was not a simple gardener, but a rare flower that was about to bloom in the most spectacular way imaginable, and that the world she would soon inhabit would make his own look small, provincial, and painfully ironically boring. The silence that descended after Richard's departure was profound. It was heavier than the oppressive quiet that had defined their marriage. This was a vacuum, a void where a life used to be. For the first 24 hours, Clara did not move from the conservatory. She sat on a wrought-iron bench, her hands resting in her lap, and watched the light change as the sun arced across the sky. The vibrant reds and golds of the autumn trees outside seemed to mock the grey numbness that had enveloped her. Richard's words echoed in the void. Boring. Sterile. A relic. Each word was a stone, and she felt as if she were at the bottom of a deep well. The stones piled on her chest, crushing the air from her lungs. She had dedicated her entire adult life to being his wife. It wasn't just a role, it was her identity. She had sublimated her own desires, her own ambitions, her own self for so long that she wasn't sure who Clara Peterson was anymore. Had she ever been anyone but Mrs. Richard Reese? The staff who had moved through the house with ghost-like tread for years now seemed unsure how to approach her. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a stern but not unkind woman who had been with them for a decade, finally breached the conservatory door on the second morning. She held a silver tray with a porcelain teapot and a single cup. "Ma'am," she said softly, her voice thick with concern. "You must have something." Clara looked up, her eyes unfocused. She saw the familiar pattern on the teacup, the same Royal Doulton set they'd received as a wedding gift 20 years ago. A wave of nausea, sharp and violent, washed over her. It was all part of the cage, the beautiful, exquisitely crafted cage. "Take it away, Martha," she said, her voice raspy. "Please. Take it all away." Confused, Mrs. Gable hesitated. "Ma'am." "Everything." Clara clarified, a strange, feverish energy beginning to prickle beneath her skin. The china, the silver, the crystal. "Pack it up. Donate it. I don't want to see any of it ever again." That was the first crack in the dam of her composure. The command, the first decision she had made for herself in years that wasn't about a menu or a seating chart, felt like a jolt of electricity. Over the next few days, the numbness gave way to a storm of emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel for 2 decades. Grief, raw and gut-wrenching, would ambush her at unexpected moments. She found one of Richard's old sweaters in a closet, and the familiar scent of his cologne, a scent she used to find comforting, sent her spiraling into a fit of weeping, so intense she thought her heart would break. But beneath the grief was something else, something she hadn't felt since she was a young woman with a scholarship to the Sorbonne and a world of possibilities at her feet. Anger. It was a clean, hot, righteous anger. How dare he? How dare he take the best years of her life, the years she had devoted to him, to their family, and discard them like a business asset that was no longer performing? How dare he call her boring when she was the architect of the very world that allowed him his glamour? He had made his choice clear. His lawyers, a team of sharks from a top Manhattan firm, sent over the divorce papers via courier. They were as cold and clinical as Richard's final words. He was as promised generous. The settlement offered her the Greenwich estate, a lump sum that would ensure she never had to work again, and staggering lifelong alimony. It was hush money, a golden muzzle, to ensure she disappeared quietly. Clara sat at the massive mahogany desk in Richard's now abandoned study, the papers spread out before her. She picked up the expensive fountain pen Richard had left behind, a Mont Blanc that probably cost more than her first car. She looked at the signature line for Clara Reese, and she smiled. A real smile, not the placid, polite one she'd worn for years. This one had an edge. She took the pen and in a clear, bold hand crossed out the entire settlement section. She wrote a single sentence across the page. "As agreed, I waive all claims to marital assets, property, and alimony." She then signed her name, but not as they had written it. She signed for the first time in 20 years as Clara Peterson. She sent the papers back via a standard postal service, not a courier. The act felt momentous, like shedding a heavy diamond-encrusted skin. Of course, Richard's lawyers called immediately, their tone a mixture of disbelief and frantic concern. Was she unwell? Was she under duress? Did she understand what she was giving up? I understand perfectly, Clara told the senior partner, a man named Mr. Abernathy, whom she had hosted for dinner a dozen times. I am in my right mind, and I am under no duress. I want nothing. Please proceed with the divorce on these terms. The news, she knew, would get back to Richard. He wouldn't understand it. He would see it as weakness, as foolishness. He could never comprehend that walking away from his fortune was the only way she could reclaim her soul. It was a language he didn't speak. Her first real taste of freedom was terrifying. She had no money of her own, save for a small, long-forgotten savings account from before her marriage that held a few $1,000s. The day the divorce was finalized, she packed a single suitcase. She took no designer clothes, no jewelry, save for a simple silver locket her grandmother had given her. She walked through the grand marble foyer of the house that had been her prison one last time. Mrs. Gable and the other staff stood in a sad, awkward line. "Where will you go, ma'am?" Mrs. Gable asked, her eyes wet with tears. "I'm not sure yet," Clara admitted, and the honesty of it was both frightening and exhilarating. "But I'm going forward." She didn't take a chauffeured car. She called a local taxi. As the cab pulled away from the imposing iron gates, she didn't look back. She drove to a modest hotel in Stamford, a world away from the luxury she was used to. The room was small. The wallpaper was peeling slightly in one corner, and the view was of a parking lot. It was the most beautiful room she had ever seen. For the first time, Clara Peterson was truly alone. And it was in that solitude that the seed of her past began to stir. Before Richard, before the gilded cage, there had been another Clara. A brilliant, ambitious young woman who spoke 4 languages fluently. A student of art history and culture who had graduated summa cum laude. A woman who had been on a very different path before she'd met a charming, intensely focused young banker who had promised her the world. He had given her a version of it, but he had taken her own in exchange. One evening, scrolling aimlessly on a new cheap laptop she'd bought, she stumbled upon an article. It was about the struggles of heritage luxury brands to connect with a new generation. The article mentioned a specific iconic French perfumer, La Perle, known for its classic timeless scents, but now seen as dated something your grandmother would wear. La Perle was headquartered in Paris, a city she hadn't seen since her honeymoon. A memory sparked. A younger Clara, backpacking through Europe, standing before the very first La Perle boutique on the Place Vendôme. She remembered being captivated by the history, the story behind the brand, which was founded in the 1920s by a daring woman who broke all the rules. The founder, Céleste Dubois, had been a visionary, a storyteller who sold not just perfume, but a dream of Parisian elegance and audacity. Clara fell down a rabbit hole of research. She read everything she could about La Perle, its history, its recent marketing failures, its struggle to stay relevant in a market dominated by fleeting celebrity endorsements. The current CEO, Jean-Luc Moreau, was the founder's grandson, a traditionalist struggling to navigate the modern world. They were losing market share at an alarming rate. They were, in a word, boring. And that's when the seed dormant for 20 years finally sprouted. She wasn't Mrs. Richard Rees, the quiet hostess. She was Clara Peterson, the scholar, the linguist, the strategist. Richard had called her boring because she understood history, culture, and subtlety in a way his brute force mind never could. He saw it as a weakness. But what if it was her greatest strength? She knew why La Perle was failing. They had forgotten their story. They were selling a product, not a legacy. They were trying to compete with ephemeral trends when their true value lay in their timelessness. They needed someone who understood that. Someone who could speak the language of heritage not as a dusty relic, but as a living, breathing entity. A wild, audacious idea began to form in her mind. It was insane. She had been out of the professional world for 2 decades. She had no resume, no recent experience. She was a middle-aged, divorced housewife with a gap in her employment history as wide as the Grand Canyon. But she also had nothing to lose. She opened a blank document on her laptop. She began to write. She didn't write a cover letter. She wrote a story. The story of La Perle as she saw it. She wrote about Céleste Dubois, about the spirit of the roaring 20s, about the essence of Parisian chic. She wrote a manifesto, a vision for how to make the world fall in love with La Perle all over again. Not by changing its core identity, but by reawakening it. She analyzed their failures with the same precision she once used to critique Renaissance art. She proposed a new narrative, one that connected the brand's heritage to the modern desire for authenticity. It took her a week working feverishly in her small hotel room, fueled by cheap coffee and a burning sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a lifetime. When she was done, she had a 50-page document, a bold, brilliant, and deeply personal vision. She found Jean-Luc Moreau's email address through a business database. With a trembling hand, she attached the document. Wrote a simple subject line. The soul of the pearl, and sent it into the digital ether, a message in a bottle cast out from the shores of her old life. She didn't expect a reply. It was a foolish, desperate act. But it was her act. And as she pressed send, Clara Peterson felt the last remnants of Richard Rhys's shadow finally lift. She was no longer a discarded queen. She was a player entering the game on her own terms. While Clara was rediscovering herself in a Stamford hotel room, Richard Rhys was celebrating his liberation. He and Annalise were the new power couple of Manhattan. They were photographed at every exclusive event, their images splashed across the pages of society magazines. Annalise was a dazzling accessory on his arm, her husky French accent and couture wardrobe a perfect complement to his aggressive brand of capitalism. Richard felt reborn, vindicated. He had shed his boring domestic skin and emerged as the man he was always meant to be. He barely thought of Clara. When he did, it was with a vague sense of pity. He imagined her rattling around the cavernous Greenwich house, tending her orchids and slowly fading into obscurity. The news that she had refused his fortune had baffled and briefly annoyed him. He'd interpreted it as a pathetic attempt at martyrdom, a final weak protest. Her loss, he'd remarked to Annalise with a dismissive shrug before pouring them both another glass of vintage Dom Perignon. His life was full of noise, excitement, and success. The silence he had left behind in Greenwich was a world away. But sometimes in the dead of night when the thrill of a party had faded, or Annalise was asleep beside him, a strange emptiness would creep in. He would find himself missing the simple, infuriating calm Clara used to bring to his life. He missed the scent of her Earl Grey tea in the mornings, the way she knew exactly how he liked his toast, the quiet, unspoken understanding that had once existed between them. These were fleeting, intrusive thoughts, which he quickly crushed with thoughts of his next acquisition or a plan for a weekend getaway on the yacht. He was Richard Rhys. He didn't do nostalgia. 3 weeks after Clara sent her audacious email, her cheap burner phone buzzed on the nightstand of her hotel room. The caller ID was an international number from France. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She answered, her voice a little shaky. "Hello, may I speak with Clara Peterson?" The voice was male, with a rich Parisian accent. "This is she," Clara managed. "Ms. Peterson, this is Jean-Luc Moreau." Clara sat bolt upright in bed, her mind racing. It was him, the CEO of La Perle. "Monsieur Moreau," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Thank you for calling." "Non, Ms. Peterson, it is I who must thank you," he said, his voice filled with a genuine, almost urgent energy. "I have read your manifesto. I have read it 3 times. You have looked into the soul of my family's company. You see it in a way my own marketing department has not been able to for a decade. You see the ghost of my grandmother Celeste in the machine. It is remarkable." Clara was speechless. "I have a proposition for you," he continued. "It is unorthodox, I admit, but these are desperate times. I want you to come to Paris. I want you to work with us. Not as a consultant who advises from a distance. I want you to lead this. I want to create a new position for you. Ambassador of the brand. You will be the face and the voice of La Perle's Renaissance." The offer was so far beyond her wildest dreams that she almost laughed. Ambassador of the brand, her the boring housewife from Greenwich. "Monsieur Moreau," she started. "I have to be honest with you. My resume, it has a 20-year gap." "I am not hiring a resume, Ms. Peterson," he replied firmly. "I am hiring a vision. I am hiring the woman who wrote those 50 pages. That woman understands luxury legacy and storytelling better than anyone I have ever met. Can you be in Paris by next week? We will handle all the arrangements." A week later, Clara Peterson stepped out of a taxi and onto the Place Vendôme. The familiar grey Parisian sky and the elegant arched windows of the surrounding buildings felt like a homecoming. She was no longer a tourist peering in from the outside. She was here with a purpose. La Perle had put her up in a chic apartment in Le Marais, a far cry from the Stamford Hotel. But it was its understated Parisian elegance, not its opulence, that she revelled in. It was a home, not a cage. Her first meeting with Jean-Luc Moreau confirmed her instincts. He was a man in his late 50s, with weary eyes, but a passionate heart trapped between honoring his grandmother's legacy and the relentless demands of the modern market. He felt like a caretaker of a museum, and Clara was the first person who had shown him how to make the exhibits come alive again. He gave her complete creative freedom. "Show us the way," he'd said simply. And Clara bloomed. The quiet, reserved woman who had been afraid to voice an opinion at her own dinner table was gone. In her place was a confident, articulate strategist. She spent her first weeks immersing herself in the company archives, reading Celeste Dubois' journals, touching the original glass bottles, inhaling the history of the place. She found that the steel she'd discovered within herself during her confrontation with Richard had always been there, a core of strength she had simply forgotten she possessed. She started not with a massive advertising campaign, but with the story. She worked with the perfumers to revive one of Celeste's original unreleased scents from the 1920s. A daring, complex fragrance based on night-blooming jasmine and a hint of smoky leather. They called it Audace. Audacity. Then she planned the launch. It wasn't a splashy, celebrity-filled party. It was an intimate, exclusive event held at the Musée Rodin. They didn't invite influencers famous for being famous. They invited artists, writers, historians, and entrepreneurs, women of substance from around the world. Clara herself was the host. The transformation was astonishing. Working with a stylist from the La Perle team, she found a new look that was an extension of her true self. She cut her hair into a chic jaw-length bob. Her wardrobe was no longer simple or safe. It was a collection of exquisitely tailored pieces from French designers, a sharp Lanvin tuxedo jacket, a flowing Chloe blouse, a perfectly cut Dior dress. The clothes didn't wear her. She inhabited them. Her natural grace was still there, but now it was infused with a palpable confidence. The quietness that Richard had mistaken for dullness was revealed to be a deep, thoughtful poise. At the launch of Audace, she took the stage. She spoke for 10 minutes without notes in flawless French. She didn't talk about market share or demographics. She told a story. The story of Celeste Dubois, a woman who built an empire with nothing but her nerve and her nose. The story of audacity of reclaiming one's narrative. As she spoke, weaving the history of the brand with a modern message of empowerment, she was captivating. She wasn't selling perfume. She was sharing a philosophy. She was radiant, intelligent, and utterly compelling. The event was a phenomenal success. The story went viral not because of a hashtag, but because of its authenticity. Articles appeared in Vogue, Paris Le Monde, and the Financial Times, praising La Perle's brilliant, soulful rebranding. They all centered on the mysterious and elegant new ambassador, Clara Peterson, the woman who had seemingly come from nowhere to resurrect a sleeping giant. Clara's new life was a whirlwind. She traveled across Europe to Milan, London, and Geneva, hosting intimate events, giving interviews, and becoming the living embodiment of the brand's new identity. Timeless elegance with a modern, intelligent edge. She was working harder than she ever had in her life, and she had never felt more alive. The emptiness that had haunted her old life was filled with purpose, creativity, and the joy of building something of her own. She was no longer a reflection of a powerful man. She was the source of her own light. She sent her children, who were initially shocked and worried by the divorce postcards, from every city. She had long, honest conversations with them over video calls, explaining not just what had happened, but who she was becoming. For the first time, they saw her not just as their mother, but as a woman in her own right, and their pride in her was a balm to her soul. One night, sitting on the balcony of her Paris apartment, overlooking the glittering city, a glass of Sancerre in her hand, she thought of Richard. She felt no anger, no bitterness, just a strange, distant pity for a man who had so much but understood so little. He had looked at a diamond, and because it was uncut, had mistaken it for a common stone and thrown it away. She raised her glass to the city, to her new life, to Clara Peterson. The Renaissance was complete. Now the world was about to take notice. Richard Rhys was on top of the world, or so he told himself. The acquisition of Annelise's fashion house, now under the Rhys Capital umbrella, had gone through, and the deal was being lauded on Wall Street as another masterstroke. He and Annelise had just returned from a week in Saint Bart's, a whirlwind of beach parties and sunset cruises on the Legacy. Yet the gnawing emptiness persisted, a low hum of dissatisfaction beneath the roar of his success. Annelise, he was discovering, was a high-maintenance flame. Her passion, which had seemed so intoxicating, now felt demanding. Her ambition, which had mirrored his own, now felt competitive. Their conversations were less about shared ideas and more like negotiations, each subtly jockeying for position. The effortless glamour she exuded required a staggering amount of effort to maintain, and the bills for her couture wardrobe and lavish tastes were astronomical. Not that he couldn't afford it, but it felt transactional. The quiet peace he had once fled now seemed like a distant, desirable luxury. He found himself thinking of Clara at the oddest times. He'd see a woman with a graceful posture or hear a soft laugh in a restaurant, and his head would turn a jolt of something running through him before he realized his mistake. He'd dismissed her as boring, but he was starting to realize that what he'd called boring was actually a deep, unshakable sense of self that he, for all his wealth and power, profoundly lacked. He was a collection of his successes, his possessions. Who was he without them? The question terrified him, so he pushed it down and worked harder, partied louder. The moment the world shifted on its axis happened on a rainy Tuesday night in November. He was in the media room of his Park Avenue penthouse, a vast space dominated by a wall-sized television screen. Annalise was out at some fashion event he'd had no interest in attending. He was idly flipping through channels, a glass of Macallan 25 in his hand, feeling restless and irritable. He landed on a 24-hour business news channel. They were running a special segment, Titans of Tradition, How Heritage Brands Are Reclaiming the Future. He watched with mild interest as they covered legacy automakers and watchmakers. Then the screen filled with the iconic pearlescent logo of La Perle. But perhaps the most stunning turnaround story of the year comes from the world of French perfume. The female anchor said, her voice bright with enthusiasm. The legendary house of La Perle, once considered a brand for an older generation, has seen a staggering 40% growth in the last quarter, driven by a rebranding campaign that has been hailed as nothing short of genius. Richard grunted, taking a sip of scotch. Good for them. The campaign, the anchor continued, is the brainchild of their new and famously private brand ambassador, a woman who has become as much of a sensation as the perfume she represents. We have a clip from her recent interview in London. The screen cut to a beautifully shot segment. A woman was seated in a plush armchair in what looked like a library of a 5-star hotel. She was the epitome of elegance, wearing a cream-colored silk blouse and sharp black trousers. Her blonde hair was styled in a sophisticated bob, and her smile was both warm and incredibly confident. She was speaking with the interviewer, her expression intelligent and engaged. Richard froze. The glass of scotch stopped halfway to his lips. His heart gave a painful, violent lurch, as if it had been struck by a physical blow. The blood drained from his face. It couldn't be. But it was. It was Clara. It was his. Clara, but transformed into someone he didn't recognize, yet knew intimately. The face was the same, but the light behind her eyes was different. The quiet, almost apologetic poise had been replaced by a powerful magnetic presence. Her voice, which he remembered as soft and placating, was now clear, measured, and authoritative. And I believe authenticity is the new luxury, the woman on the screen, Clara, was saying. Consumers are tired of fleeting trends. They want a story. They want to connect with something real, something with soul. La Perle doesn't sell a scent. We offer a piece of history, a feeling of timeless, intelligent elegance. That's a narrative that doesn't need to be invented, merely rediscovered. The interviewer was hanging on her every word. They're calling you the Pearl of Paris. You came out of nowhere. The world is dying to know who is Clara Peterson. Clara smiled, a graceful, enigmatic smile, that sent a shiver down Richard's spine. It was a smile of a woman who knew her own worth, a woman with secrets. "I'm a woman who believes in the power of a good story," she said simply, her hazel eyes twinkling. "And I've just started telling mine." Richard dropped the glass. It shattered on the polished hardwood floor, the amber liquid and shards of crystal scattering like the fragments of his composure. He couldn't breathe. He stumbled forward, pressing his hands against the cold screen, as if he could touch her, as if he could confirm she was real. Clara Peterson. She had taken back her name. Boring. The word echoed in his skull, a venomous taunt now turned back on himself. That woman on the screen was the furthest thing from boring he had ever seen. She was compelling. She was brilliant. She was a star, and he, Richard Reese, the kingmaker, had thrown her away like trash. A frantic, obsessive energy seized him. He grabbed his laptop, his hands shaking so violently he could barely type. He searched her name. Clara Peterson. La Perle. The results flooded his screen. Dozens of articles from the world's most respected publications. Vogue, Forbes, the Wall Street Journal. There were pictures of her stepping out of a car at Paris Fashion Week, looking impossibly chic. Speaking at a conference in Geneva, commanding the stage. Laughing with Jean-Luc Moreau, a look of genuine camaraderie and respect between them. He read every word, his face a mask of disbelief and a dawning, sickening horror. He read about her genius 50-page manifesto, about her meteoric rise, about the industry's awe at her talent. He saw his own words, his own insults reflected back at him in the descriptions of the brand she had saved. They had called La Perle dated, a relic, boring. She had taken the very things he had despised in her and turned them into a multi-million-dollar success story. When Annalise came home an hour later, she found him sitting in the dark, the shattered glass still on the floor, his face pale and haggard. The television was still on, frozen, on an image of Clara's smiling face. "Richard." "What happened?" she asked, her voice sharp with annoyance at the mess. "Did you have a fall?" He looked up at her perfectly made-up face and her aggressively fashionable dress. And for the first time, he saw her as shallow. A beautiful, glittering, empty shell. He had traded a diamond for a piece of glass. "My wife." He whispered, his voice hoarse. "I saw my wife on television." Annalise frowned, confused. "Your ex-wife, the boring one." "Did she win the lottery?" she asked with a condescending laugh. Richard flinched, as if she had slapped him. "Don't call her that," he said, his voice dangerously low. He turned the television back on and played the clip again. Annalise watched her perfectly sculpted eyebrows rising higher and higher. Her mouth fell open. She recognized power and influence when she saw it. And the woman on the screen radiated both. She looked from the screen, back to Richard's shattered expression, and a flicker of insecurity, quickly followed by anger, crossed her face. "Well," she said, trying to sound dismissive. "She cleans up now." But the damage was done. Richard was no longer listening. He was lost in the image on the screen. He felt an overwhelming, desperate urge to talk to her, to understand. He started with an email. It was a clumsy, pathetic attempt at reconciliation. "Saw you on TV. You look good. We should talk." He hit send, his heart pounding. Days passed with no reply. The silence from her was louder than any argument. He was used to people responding to him immediately. The lack of a response was a power play, and he knew it. He was no longer the one in control. He tried calling the La Perle headquarters in Paris, asking to be put through to Clara Peterson. A polite, firm assistant informed him that Ms. Peterson's schedule was fully committed. "May I take a message?" the assistant asked. "Just tell her Richard Reese called." He said the name that once opened any door, now feeling useless. He knew she got the messages, and he knew she was ignoring him. The realization was a slow, agonizing burn. He who had discarded her was now the one desperate for a scrap of attention. The hunter had become the supplicant, and his obsession, fueled by rejection and a dawning, terrifying understanding of what he had lost, was just beginning. Richard's obsession grew into a fever. The more Clara ignored him, the more he needed to see her to confront this new reality she had built without him. His work at Reese Capital, the empire that had been the center of his universe, now felt like a distraction. Deals that once thrilled him seemed meaningless. The glittering world he had craved now felt hollow, its inhabitants vapid. Annalise's constant chatter about fashion shows and socialites grated on his nerves. He saw the world and his own life through new eyes, Clara's eyes, and he found it all wanting. He became erratic. He snapped at his partner's missed important meetings. He would sit at his desk for hours, not working, but endlessly refreshing the news feeds for any mention of Clara Peterson. He saw her everywhere, her face on the side of a bus in an ad for Ordus, her name quoted in a business article, a candid photo of her walking along the Seine, looking serene and powerful. She was a ghost haunting his new life, a constant reminder of his monumental miscalculation. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He had to see her. Pleading and emailing had failed, so he decided to do what he had always done. When he wanted something, he would use his power and money to force a meeting. He flew to Paris on his private jet. He didn't tell Annalise where he was going. He checked into the presidential suite at the Ritz, a place of opulent luxury that felt cold and lonely. From his window, he had a perfect view of the Place Vendôme, and nestled among the famous jewelers was the shimmering flagship boutique of La Perle. It was like she was taunting him. His plan was crude, a brute force attack born of desperation. He had his top legal and financial team draw up a proposal, an unsolicited, extremely generous offer from Reese Capital to acquire a majority stake in La Perle. It was an offer so far above market value that any board would be forced to consider it. It was his way of kicking down the door. He knew that as the public face and strategic architect of the brand's success, Clara would have to be in the room when he presented it. He would finally have her attention. The proposal sent shockwaves through the French business community. La Perle was a family-owned institution. It wasn't for sale. But Richard's offer was so aggressive it couldn't be ignored. A formal meeting was set. Jean-Luc Moreau would be there, along with his board. And as he had intended, so would Clara Peterson. The day of the meeting, Richard dressed with military precision in his most powerful suit, a dark charcoal brioni. He walked across the Place Vendôme to the La Perle headquarters, his face a mask of grim determination. He felt the old thrill of the hunt return, but this time the stakes felt different. This wasn't about money or power. It was about reclaiming a part of himself he had thrown away. He was shown into a grand, antique-paneled boardroom. Jean-Luc Moreau and his board members, a collection of stern-faced French aristocrats and executives, were already seated. And at the far end of the table, silhouetted against a large window overlooking the square, was Clara. She stood up as he entered. She was wearing a tailored dress in a deep shade of sapphire that brought out the fire in her hazel eyes. She looked at him not with anger or hurt or even triumph. She looked at him with a cool, dispassionate curiosity, the way a scientist might observe a specimen under a microscope. The look unnerved him, more than any display of emotion could have. "Richard," she said, her voice calm and even. It was the first time she had spoken his name in months. "What a surprise." "Clara," he replied, his own voice sounding strained to his ears. "You look well." "I am well," she said, gesturing to a chair opposite her. "Please, let's not waste time with pleasantries. You have an offer for us." The meeting was a masterclass in humiliation. Richard launched into his presentation, laying out the financial benefits of his offer with his usual ruthless clarity. He spoke of synergy, of global expansion, of the power of Reese Capital. He was at the top of his game, but his words felt hollow even to him. The entire time he was acutely aware of Clara's gaze. She didn't interrupt. She simply listened. Her hands steepled before her an occasional, almost imperceptible nod to Jean-Luc Moreau, who sat beside her, his expression unreadable. When he finished, there was a long silence. "Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Reese," Jean-Luc Moreau said finally, his tone icy. "It is bold, as is your method of arranging this meeting." "I'm a bold man," Richard said, trying to project confidence. Moreau glanced at Clara. She gave a slight shake of her head. "We appreciate the valuation you have placed on our company." Moreau continued, "But La Perle is not for sale. It is the legacy of my family. It is not a mere asset to be acquired and stripped for parts, which I believe is your specialty." The insult landed sharp and precise. "Now, if you'll excuse us," Moreau said, standing up. "We have business to attend to." The other board members began to gather their papers and file out of the room, leaving Richard sitting there, his multi-billion-dollar offer dismissed as if it were nothing. Only Clara remained. She walked from her end of the table and stood before him. "Was this what this was all about?" "Richard," she asked softly once they were alone. "All this corporate theater, just to get my attention." He couldn't hold her gaze. He looked down at his hands on the polished table. I had to see you, Clara. I saw you on television. I don't understand." "What don't you understand?" She pressed her voice, still quiet, but now laced with steel. "That the woman you called boring had a brain, that the woman you left for a fiery and alive model could build something of her own. What you don't understand, Richard, is that you never knew me at all. I made a mistake." He whispered, the admission costing him everything. "No," she corrected him. "It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. You chose a life that glittered over one that had substance. You chose a reflection over a real person. You didn't just leave me, Richard. You abandoned the best part of yourself, the part that could still appreciate quiet strength, that could still value something other than a stock price." She walked to the window and looked down at the bustling square. "I was the curator of your life. I made it beautiful and seamless so you could go out and play your games. And you convinced yourself that the curator was just part of the furniture. You forgot she had her own thoughts, her own history, her own dreams." She turned back to him, and for the first time he saw a flicker of the old, gentle Clara, but it was layered with a newfound strength that made her breathtaking. "I want to thank you, Richard," she said, and he looked up, stunned. "Thank me?" "Yes. By casting me out, you set me free. You forced me to find the woman I was before you, the woman I had buried for 20 years. You thought you were kicking me out into the cold, but you pushed me out into the sun." She picked up a single elegant bottle of Ordus from a side table. "This is my life now. I am building something that has a soul, something that will last." "What are you building, Richard?" Another shell company, another empty monument to your ego. He had no answer. He felt stripped bare, his power, his money, his arrogance, all rendered meaningless before her quiet, unshakable truth. He had come here for a battle, but she had already won the war long ago in a small hotel room in Stamford. "I want you back," he said, the words clumsy and raw. A sad smile touched her lips. "The person you want back doesn't exist anymore," she said, "and the person I am now, she would never choose you. You see, I finally have a life that isn't boring, and I have no intention of giving it up." She placed the perfume bottle on the table in front of him. A final, beautiful, fragrant dismissal. "Goodbye, Richard." She walked out of the boardroom without a backward glance, her heels clicking decisively on the floor, leaving him alone in the opulent room with nothing but the scent of audacity and the bitter taste of regret. He had kicked out his boring wife, and he had just seen her on the world's stage. He now knew that he hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost his anchor, his conscience, and the only person who had ever truly known him. And he had been too blind and too arrogant to see it until it was far, far too late. Clara's story is a powerful reminder that a person's worth is never determined by someone else's opinion. It's about the full within the quiet strengths we cultivate and the courage to start over even when it seems impossible. Richard Rees learned the hard way that the things he valued, power, glamour, and money, were nothing compared to the substance and soul he threw away. Clara didn't just get revenge. She got a life, her own authentic, brilliant life. What did you think of Clara's incredible transformation? Have you ever witnessed someone underestimate a person so completely? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of betrayal and ultimate triumph resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for more real-life drama that will leave you thinking.